Thank you all very much for turning up. Great to see so many people here. So yes, I'm going to talk about some work I've been doing mostly with Jeff Tuck, who's in the audience there. Jeff's got me interested in sports analytics, always been an Aussie Rules footy fan, but it's always fun to try and spread your interests. But what I normally do has got nothing to do with sports analytics. In fact, I'm normally a quantitative ecologist. I didn't realise there was an initial slide that already outlined my interests. Here it is again, just for those of you that don't know me very well. Very interested in, as I said, quantitative ecology, and basically I just like talking to people who have interesting questions in biology, and in particular if they need help with anything quantitative. So I worked in sort of population biology, done a lot of work in disease ecology, particularly mange in wombats, which is a big issue here in Tasmania. Applied conservation, so use modelling to try and help come up with what we think might be successful conservation efforts, particularly with respect to flatback turtles, which are on the northwest coast of Australia. And I'm also interested in all sorts of things related to behavioural and evolutionary ecology. I do a little bit of stats. I've done a little bit of work on AIC, so model selection, and trying to work out good practice on how to do that. And more recently looked at trying to come up with some approaches related to cross-validation, so this idea of comparing models. And also, if you're at UTAS and you do some statistics at some point, either as an undergraduate or as a postgraduate, you may well come across me. I do a lot of teaching there, and also do a bit of teaching in behavioural and evolutionary ecology. So my interests are quite broad, but today I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about footy. And as I mentioned earlier, this is really a collaboration between with me and Jeff Tuck, and also Dean Dagan from the Adelaide Footy Club. So I've got a picture here of Jeff. For those of you that don't know Jeff, he's... well, yeah, you can see me. There's me. I don't know if you can see the pointer or not. There's Jeff. It's not pointing to Abby, it's pointing to Jeff. So yes, we're big Crows fans, and in fact, I probably should get myself a bit better prepared for the talk. So yeah, you'll see that I am a Crows fan throughout the talk, but all the results are unbiased with regards to that, I promise. So as I mentioned, I've got a broad set of skills. In theory, I could model the reproductive output and the spread of disease amongst AFL players, but instead I'm going to try and model their game day performance, and in particular try and get an understanding of how does their performance typically change with age. There are a bunch of practical applications for this. When we're going to talk about something like game day performance, the first question is, well, how do you quantify how well a player's done when they've spent an afternoon on the footy oval? And there are lots of metrics out there that you can use to quantify the performance of a player. I'm going to use some publicly available data. Many of you, if you're interested in sports analytics and AFL, will know that there's an amazing package that you can use if you program in the statistical language called Fitzroy, and it sort of scrapes the web and pulls down a lot of game day data for you. So I'm going to use one of the metrics that's publicly available. It's a player rating system. And to be honest, I don't really know exactly how the numbers are derived, but I've sort of played with the models I'm about to show you with different metrics of performance, and the results tend to be the same irrespective. Okay, so the idea is, can I predict these rating points? And you might go, well, why care about this? Well, there are potential applications for understanding whether players are changing in their ability over the course of their career, and you can imagine that there may be relevance related to list management questions. So every year, and particularly at this time of year, AFL clubs are deciding who do they keep on their list. I think they need to remove 3 players every year from their list. And that's a very difficult decision to make. I certainly wouldn't want to be the one making it. But maybe I can offer some assistance with some of the modelling that I'll show today. The other sort of thing that might be of interest at this time of year for AFL clubs is, trading players. So not only do you get who do you get rid of on your list, can you swap players or bring in players that you rate highly, and if you can do that well, obviously that's going to benefit the team. And the other thing is, why is this a question we should care about? And it's just because it's interesting. You know, I do lots of my things just because it's interesting. So I've got a couple of pickies here. So this particularly related to the Adelaide Crows. So at the moment, as I said, they're deciding which players should be retained on the list. And this is a picture of two current AFL players that were recruited at the same time. And underneath here is a picture of Modra doing a specky, because I just miss those days. All right. So, okay, so if we're going to make we're going to model age-dependent performance, you know, do we have any expectations about what we think might be going on? It's always fun to have a think about what you think the answer is before you perform an analysis and see whether your intuition was correct or not. And you may expect that, in fact, there may be changes in how well players are performing these days compared to the past with regards to age. And, you know, there's lots of, it's a big business, AFL, and so there's lots of improvements in both sports science and coaching practices, and maybe because of these changes, and also maybe the introduction of, you know, young talent academies and so on, you know, this focus on improving younger players before they even get to an AFL team, you know, maybe these changes in practices are making the new draftees coming into a team sort of performing relatively better than what they were in the past. Okay, so you may have an expectation that if this is going on, that younger players are actually becoming relatively better than what they were in the past. And, you know, if you know anything about footy, you know, there are a couple of young players at the moment that just seem stupidly good. You know, so Nick Daicos and Harry Sheezel are very young players, but you know, you wouldn't know that they've only got 1 or 2, maybe 3 years of AFL experience the way they play compared to older players in their team. And you know, you might subsequently be thinking, well, how important is experience given maybe these changes that are happening? So I think the question's interesting. So how do we model AFL performance? Well, it's probably not just as simple as comparing these ratings that you're getting from scraping data from the internet. There are going to be lots of sort of variables that influence how well a player performs with regards to whatever rating you end up choosing. You know, a classic one would be, well, you know, how long does a player spend on the ground? So they're accumulating these rating points during a game. So obviously the longer they're on the ground, the more opportunities they've got to accumulate ratings per game. But also another thing that might be important is, where do they play on the field? So there are some positions that you're more likely to accumulate rating points. You know, if you're playing in the midfield, you know, your job is to try and be around where the ball is most of the time, certainly relative to defenders and forwards. So if we're going to try and understand how things are changing in terms of player performance, I think we need to know where they're playing on the ground. It's a bit tricky these days because players are pretty versatile, and whether you can say a player spent most of its time in a certain position is harder to do now than the older days. But we got some estimates of, for each game a player played, you know, roughly what sort of position were they playing. So I just want to show you here a little bit of sort of summary statistics that gives us an idea of what we're going to have in our model if we're going to try and predict performance. So what I've done is I've filtered the data to players who played a game. So if you want to get in my database, you've got to have played 45 minutes in a game, and you must have played at least 5 games in your career. Okay, so I'm trying to not have the occasional rare event appear as in the outcomes. It's not too important exactly how you do this filtering, but if you do this, I've been able to get data from 2012 to the last time I scraped the data was, or got the data sent to me, was mid-2024, so nearly up to date. But if you take these requirements, I've got data on about nearly 1,500 AFL players, and in total, I've got 110,000 games. So we've got a bit of data to play here with. And just on average, players played about 55 games. The median number of games a player played was 55, and the ages of these players is between 80 and 40. So quite a wide spread there. I'll let people try and guess who was 40 when they were still playing AFL. So what does the data suggest? Oh, and I guess before I move on, here, what I'm going to do is I've got a whole range of sort of categorizations of where a player sort of played on the ground, but I'm going to sort of simplify it a bit. So you can see that depending on where you played, sort of influences how many points you typically accumulated. So the champion data rating system tends to give you values, on average around 10-ish over a game. But obviously where you're playing influences how many of these points you tend to accumulate. So rucks get quite high. Defenders, maybe not surprising, accumulate fewer rating points. And then you've sort of got three types of midfielders, those that sort of spend nearly all their time in the thick of it. They're the ones that typically accumulate the most rating points. But you've got two other categories of mids, those sort of play in defence, spend less time in the middle, and those that spend a little bit more up forward. And then you've got your true forwards that also typically score less points than if you're more the centre of the ground. So my model is going to categorise players. I'll consider 6 categories for the data here. We'll look at rucks, these defenders, these non-mids, these mids, I'll call them non-key mids, non-key forwards and forwards. We don't have a lot of data on forward ruck. Okay, so if you look at those 6 categories and then plot the data, as I said, our interest is mostly with regards to age. So if you look at the average accumulation for a player of a given age in a given year, you get these patterns. Okay, so the first thing to notice is that they sort of go up and then they kind of go down a bit afterwards. So suggesting that there is an intermediate age that players typically peak at. And if you look there, you'll see that the peak age actually varies depending on typically what position you're playing. And the colours there are trying to give you a sense of whether there's been some temporal change. So the lighter colours represent more recent years. And so my interest, particularly tonight, is to try and work out where are these curves sort of peaking, and is that peak changing over time? Okay, so that's ultimately what we're going to be trying to do. Okay, so, and you might get a couple of hints here by looking at the data that mids tend to peak earlier than the forward. So, the peaks are much higher up here. So older guys tend to be performing well as a forward, but it's, you tend to drop when you get older if you're still in the middle, if you're playing in the midfield. This is the same data, but just plotted with regards to time. Okay, so you can see that, the way that players are accumulating points has changed over time depending on their position. So rucks are now accumulating many more points than what they used to before. Some of the other positions have been fairly consistent since 2012, but there's clearly a bit of a change going on over time. So I'm going to try and build this aspect into my model that you're going to see me fit in a few minutes. But looking at these, just the raw data, you might have a couple of rough conclusions about what you think's going on here. So there's not much mathematics here. I didn't really want it to be a mathsy talk, but what I do want to do is just give those of you that have a little bit of a background and happy to look at an equation or two, to give you an idea of sort of the function that I want to use to try and describe, in particular, this shape here. So I want to try and fit a curve essentially through this data where some of the parameters of that curve define where the peak is and in particular allow that peak to change over time. So there's lots of options I could have come up with. This is the one that I chose that seems to do a pretty decent job. So I'm trying to predict the average accumulation for a player of age A in season T. And I've created what, I don't know, there's probably a real word for it, but it's sort of like an asymmetric normal distribution. So basically it's got 4 components to it. It's got P, which is the peak, and tau is the peak age. So if you're age tau, you should be accumulating P points on average throughout a game. And then the sigma and the lambda are related to how your performance drops off away from the peak, either if you're younger than the peak age or if you're older than the peak age. So sigma relates to how quickly you accumulate points as you get towards the peak age, and lambda is just a metric that sort of says how's the drop-off, the rate of drop-off at the peak age afterwards compared to the rate that you approach the peak age. So a lambda of 1 essentially will give you back a symmetric normal distribution. And because the data is suggesting that where this peak age is and this peak performance is, and maybe the rate of rising to the peak and dropping from the peak could be changing over time, I've allowed these components to vary with time as well. And just for the statisticians out there, to make the model fit a bit easier, I've Z transformed time. So what this does is it means that I can, well, in fact, maybe just to visually show it, here's an example of that curve. Okay, so here it is. As I said, there are four things you need to know to draw it. So tau relates to the peak age. So this is the thing I'm most interested in. What is tau? P is the average performance at that peak age, and the sigma and the lambda times sigma, as I said, describe how you rise to it and then drop off afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to try and fit this curve to all the data, but mostly I'm interested in this tau component of the model. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is just look at the data and say, well, okay, well, what's the nature of the data that I'm trying to predict? So these ratings, you know, what's the uncertainty? What's the variation in those ratings? If you look at the data, I don't know why, but however they calculate this player rating, it comes as to 1 decimal point. So what I've done is I've times them all by 10, and then now they're all integers, and I'm going to use something akin to the negative binomial distribution to describe the natural variation in the data. If you look at the ratings, some players get negative values. I don't know what you have to do on the field to get a negative value, but to save player embarrassment, I'm going to chop it off at 0. So it doesn't make a huge difference to the overall fit. You know, maybe we can come up with some improvements. But I'm going to use essentially roughly a negative binomial distribution because it looks like it's got the shape of the distribution, but also recognising if you look at the time played and the number of points that a player acquired during that game, there's clearly a positive relationship there. So I will put time played on the field as one of the predictors. Okay, so, but there's a lot of variation in terms of how well players are performing, and I'm hoping that I can explain a lot of that variation by knowing their age and the season and the position that they were playing. Okay, but there are other things that could also be influencing the variation that we're seeing in this data. And it could come in a couple of flavours. One of them is seasonal variation. So every year, the AFL tweaks the rules a little bit. So maybe from year to year, sort of the average rate that you gain points could change depending on some of the rules. Teams are clearly changing their strategies from one year to the next. So that could influence typically how many points players are accumulating. And we get weird oddities like COVID-19. So this shortened quarters from 20 minutes to 16 minutes. So there are these sort of year-to-year fluctuations. So I'm going to try and build into my model allowance that years can vary somewhat randomly about some typical value. And the other thing, so this is the fun one, is that some of that variation is due to the players just being different. Okay, so some players accumulate these rating points more quickly than others. I'll let you decide which one you think gets more out of those two, if you know your AFL. But the way I can incorporate sort of between year variation and between player variation, statistically you can deal with that in terms of a random effect. And so even though I'm modelling a typical, I want to model sort of what's happening to a typical player of age A in season T, I'm also going to look at every player and either bump up their values up or down, depending on whether they seem to be an above average player or a below average player. And also similarly, I can tweak the seasons for above average and below average seasons. This is neat because this makes the model fit a lot better, but we get this wonderful byproduct of the model by doing this, which is that I can evaluate every player in the AFL and ask, did you look like you're above or below a typical player? And that can have implications or practical implications, as I'll show afterwards. Okay, so just trying to get the model to fit well gives us some fun little extra statistics to look at, which I'll show you. Okay, so for those of you who do the statistics, this model, so I'm going to fit the model separately to each of those 6 positions. The model, to fit it to the data, I need to estimate, 18 parameters, and I'm going to estimate them using Bayesian methods. Okay, so I'll program that code it up in Stan, and then get R in RStudio to fit that model. Okay, so an amazing package, Stan. So that's basically all I'm going to say about the technical details of the model. I'm just going to quickly now run through a bunch of the results. And so remember, the main question is, have players, are they peaking earlier? If we just look at the defenders, then in 2012, it was about 27-year-olds typically seem to be the peak age in terms of accumulating points. But by 2024, so 12 years later, the age that peak seemed to be happening seems to have dropped down to 25. So on average, it's not I guess maybe it is a huge drop, 27 down to 25 in 12 years. So now 25-year-olds seem to be the age at which peak performance is happening. And this is just showing you the points that they typically gain at that peak age. So they're kind of accumulating a few less points now than what they did in the past. And so if you put together the full fit of the model, so my model really makes predictions for how well on average does a player perform of a particular age in a particular season. Because it's a Bayesian fit, I can provide a prediction and I can show uncertainty in that prediction. What I'm showing you here, and I thought my model was terrible the first time I saw this plot, and then I understood what I was doing. What I'm showing you here is for a typical player. Okay, so a typical player is a player that has a delta value of 0. Okay, so half the players are sort of performing under that level of that age, and half the players are performing above it. Okay, so, oops, wrong way around. If you look at these fits, it looks like it's doing a pretty good job if you're young. And that's because you don't know when they're young, who's typically above or below average. Right? They need to play games before you start to assess that. But if you look for a lot of these plots, we'll see a bunch of these, that these points, so these are the averages of players of that age compared to this green line, compared to a typical player. And you see that older players are nearly always above the average. And the reason for that is that, well, if you're not above average, you're not going to stay in the system. Okay, so you can see that even though early on, the model looks like it's doing a great job, but as time goes on, those players that were below average get weeded out of the system. And so what you're left with are the older players who have proved themselves and they are above average. And so you get the observed mean being above the mean for a typical player. Okay, so clearly coaches are doing the right thing and they're choosing their teams well. They're good at identifying the better players. So the model actually does a reasonable job once you understand those figures. Here's the fun bit though, is as I said, for every player, so for every defender, I can work out, well, what was your delta value? So, and I've shown you here the players associated with the top 20 delta values. So these are, in theory, the top 20 defenders that were in the data set between 2012 and 2024. And so, according to my model, much as you believe the model and the metric used, Jeremy McGovern has turned out top, and he's known to be a very good defender. I've colour coded, so the circle represents my best estimate. This is some measure of uncertainty. So if you haven't played a lot of games, so what I've done here is I've sort of shown you what percentile you're in, the player name and how many games they played in that position. So typically the players that have played more games will have a smaller uncertainty. You've got more information about them. Okay, so you do get some oddities. May Jack Daw he only played 16 games, but according to this metric, he looked pretty good given those games. But you can see that a lot of the other players you predict to, Darcy Moore and so on, have ranked very highly according to this fit. Okay. The other thing you might do that's interesting is to ask, well, okay, now that I've sort of got an assessment of how good that player is, where did they rank in the draft? So how well does the draft pick tell you about what their future performance is likely to be? And the answer is it's not a huge amount, particularly for defenders. Okay, so these are the high draft picks, and so if you're the low values here means that you are the better performer. So I'm not sure where Jerry McGovern was, where he was picked, but he would have been one of these down here. Okay, so you can just see how hard it is to predict how well a player is going to perform in the future. And so I'll just now, given you've got a sense of how these figures work, I'll run quickly through the other ones. For forwards, so their peak performance is it stayed stagnant for a while, and it looks like maybe there's some evidence that it's dropped in the last few years. And you can see here this sort of rise. And again, older players that are still there tend to be above average players. And the fun bit, this one's crazy. My laptop loves Jeremy McGovern for some reason because he's also popped out as a pretty decent forward. I was a bit worried by this, but then if you look at the other players and you know anything about AFL, the players you would expect to be ranking high are up there. Although you're going to see that my computer also likes Jake Stringer, which is interesting because I think his future is a little bit uncertain at the moment. Okay, so again, white means that they played 5 games this year. They played this year in 2024. These guys are also hard to predict. So the draft related to where they end up in terms of this ranking is, there's some evidence that there's a bit of predictability there, but also you're getting some pretty good forwards in the 25 to 50 draft range. If we go look at our non-key forwards, again, maybe there's a little bit of an evidence of a drop over, mostly in recent years. Their overall performance has dropped. And this one, Jake Stringer, again, he's only played 15 games, so it may be a small sample size effect. I'd much more believe the second one, Gary Ablett Jr., as the best forward. So these are your smaller non-key forwards. And they're interesting. They might be a little bit easier to predict based on the draft than someone who's a defender. What have we got? We've got the midfielders. So they go up quick and then they often drop quick if you're typical. Okay, so it's hard to be a midfielder at the old age, which shows how impressive some players are, like Pendlebury, who still plays very well at his age. And there's also some evidence, again, a couple of years. So this has been a steady decline. Your elite best midfielders were doing their best typically about 27. Now it's dropped down, or 26, dropped down to about 23. So all of these things are showing the same trend. Age, you're peaking at a younger age for all of these positions. Gary Ablett, once again, seems to be the best midfielder. There's Pendlebury there, Patrick Dangerfield. So look, Jake Stringer again, extraordinary. And these guys are a little bit easier to predict based on their draft. Okay, so non-key midfielders, so these include your running defenders, again, level, but maybe in recent years it's dropped a couple of years. And then these are your best players. So remember, some players can play multiple roles in a game. Again, these guys are a bit easier to predict in terms of their draft, where they're likely to end up quality-wise throughout their career. And in the ruck, there seems to be a decline as well, although it's a bit tricky. I'm not sure how much I quite believe this, because rucks tend to be pretty old, and it seems to be a bit hard to work out where their peak is. So I take this one with a little bit more of a grain of salt. But again, all else being equal, there's some evidence that rucks are getting better, peaking at a younger age compared to some of these others. And this is an interesting one. Nick Naitanui he's the biggest outlier of anyone that I've analysed. Extraordinary. And then after Nick Naitanui, you've then got Gawn and Grundy, the names that you might expect. And they're, if you get them really early, it looks like you've got a reasonable good idea of what they're going to do, but they're all over the shop as well. Okay, so they're hard to predict. So I have an answer to the question. And the answer is that it does look like, in fact, peak performance is players are getting younger. And typically by about 2 years, kind of irrespective, I guess, of what position they typically play, but that peak age does tend to differ a bit depending on their position. And the biggest declines seem to be the forwards. So in the old days, it was the older forwards were dominating. Now some of these younger ones are doing just as good a job. So, interesting questions as to how important is, I guess, experience. And then, as I said, the other things that sort of naturally pop out of this model are relationships with the draft. And so, it looks like some positions are a bit easier to predict where they're going to be based on their draft position. So this is last year's draft, roughly the top 18 or so players in the draft. So this arrow here represents sort of the draft picks 1-ish to 18. And so you can see from this cohort here, depending on what position they're typically going to play, this is sort of, there's a lot of uncertainty there, whether in the bottom half or the top half and so on here. Okay, so their futures are largely unknown at this point. And then just a couple other quick things you can do. You can ask, well, how important is it to have good players in positions? So, a bit of fun. I've taken this year's final ordering at the end of the home and away season. So Sydney Swans were up the top, Richmond were down there, Crows. And what I've done for every player who played this year, because this is this year's ranking, I sort of plotted their delta value. So if you played a number of games in that team this year, where did you rank? Okay, and so our teams that typically have high ranking players in certain positions, does that help you predict where the team's likely to end up on the ladder? And this is suggesting it's hard. There is a bit of a trend. So typically Sydney had higher ranked players in most positions, but maybe the old truth, it's a team game. It's not single players or single position players are having a strong influence of where the team is going to end up at the end of the year. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And again, Sydney have some great some non-key forwards, but so do a lot of the other teams, and that hasn't ultimately determined where they've ended up at the end of the year. Okay, so a bit of fun to have a look at that. Well, I guess one of the other things sort of about the potential utility of a model like this is if you are interested in list management, there comes a decision where you've got to decide whether to keep a player in your team or not. The model provides a prediction of what a typical player of a certain age should be performing in their position. And so I plotted that because it's changing potentially over season. I've had to replot it every season. So the green line is for an average player, okay? And then the orange points here are the ranking points that player achieved during a game, okay? And the red or the dark orange there is just sort of the average or the median, I can't remember, of the points. And so you can kind of see, is a player currently above or below? Is there any evidence that their trajectory is changing in a different way compared to a typical player. It gives you a nice simple visual of the current state of a player that might help you decide whether you should be thinking about keeping them on or not, although I want to absolutely highlight it's just a conversation starter. This is solely based on the metric, and there's all sorts of other things clearly taken into account of whether you keep someone on their list. But it's at least one tool that you could add to your toolbox, I guess, of helping you make decisions. I think there's a lot of next things we could do if we wanted to with this model. We could, in fact, I've looked at other metrics of game day performance. Doesn't matter which one you look at, you get similar results. Ages are typically getting younger where players are peaking at their performance. You may, but I've left out a lot of things that may also have a strong influence of how well a player performs. So, what team you're in, are you playing a home game or not? I've completely ignored all of that. In the analysis, you could certainly look for those sorts of effects. And you could add a little bit of more complexity. So, one thing at the moment is the model assumes that kind of from day one, your relative performance compared to another player of your same age in that season is the same. So you're sort of always, on average, expected to be above the curve or always below throughout your career. So that's kind of saying that you're expecting this orange dot to sort of always be above or below that curve, but maybe some players are below and then getting higher. In theory, I could add a few more terms to my model to say, look, are there other unusual trends over time happening to certain players? So are some players just taking a bit longer than others to develop, and so on? So, there's still scope to put that in there. And some players just had good and bad years. Okay, so at the moment I haven't got that in there, but in theory, I don't know whether I've got enough data to add that. That's going to add a lot of parameters to my model, but maybe I can make some claims about restrictions on how those deviations could occur. But there's still a lot we can do, I think, with this model to improve it further. Okay, and then, given that we've got expectations about a typical player, maybe you could then do some more individual player-focused analyses rather than trying to fit everyone at once. We've got a nice curve that represents a baseline. Maybe we could build some different models that focus more on individual players and their specific circumstances. So that's the... as I said, I think there's a lot more that we can do here. If anyone's interested in this or wants to talk to me further, I'd love to talk to people about it. There are my contact details there. I've got quickly just a couple of minutes. I'll talk about some other work, just a couple of slides that this is some earlier work that I did with Jeff Tas. So Jeff was the one that got me interested in sports analytics. And he was particularly interested at the time on valuing draft picks. And so during the draft time, teams can trade draft picks. Okay, so there is sort of a system in place at the moment, I think, where the AFL sort of has suggested points associated with every draft pick, and maybe you could, if you want to do a swap, maybe swap two players for another two draft picks for another two draft picks. You could sum the value of each of those draft picks to get a sense of which combination might be better than another combination. But it's all very simple. But it's hard to know how to put a single number to a draft pick because, different players who are picked at the same value in the draft go on and have different performances. So one of the things you could do is say, look, maybe it makes more sense to not just associate a draft pick with a single value, but to assign it a distribution of values. Okay, so you may be lucky and get a really great player for a certain draft pick, but you could also get a player that, for whatever reason, doesn't perform well. So maybe you could try and predict the distribution of player value and use the distribution rather than single values to evaluate draft picks. So we did a quick little analysis to try and get a measure of sort of the uncertainty and the value of a player based on where they were selected in the draft. One of the things I thought was interesting was, just what's the chance a player even plays a game in the AFL based on where they were picked up in the draft? And so here on the left-hand side is, on the x-axis I've got where they were selected, and on the y-axis is the probability that they never even saw the footy field, at least for an AFL game. No team, obviously teams are petrified of not playing a first rounder or a second rounder or even a third rounder, so not rounder, third draft pick. So if you're picked at number 1, you're guaranteed to get a game at some point during your career. But it's sort of what's more interesting is, if you're picked much later on, there's still, even if you're picked around the 50s, there's about maybe a 30% chance that you won't play any games, but most players seem to get a game. So there's some uncertainty as to whether you even get a game. If you get a game, then how many, you might get one game, you might get lots of games, but you might do well or not. This is a bit tricky, but on the y-axis it's just basically a metric of player performance. So it's a bit complicated, but basically all you're looking at, higher values means that player played a lot of games throughout their career. And the assumption is that if you played a lot of games throughout your career, you did it because you were picked because you were good. Okay, so the y-axis there is something about expected future player performance, but there's a lot of uncertainty. So typically, you see that the black is the average. So what's happening is it's dropping here. So the circles represent individual players. Black represents sort of the average for that selection. So typically, those picked in the first few picks go on and play quite a number of games in the AFL system. And it drops off, but it doesn't drop off towards 0. There are lots of players picked at these low numbers that also go on and play a fair few games in the AFL. And there's a lot of uncertainty. Okay, so if you do a slice through the vertical here, this is a measure of the uncertainty in the future performance of a player based on where they were picked. And if you're thinking about trading picks, rather than putting a single value to that pick, you could, in theory, ask, well, what's my total value for a combination of picks? Well, now it's not you add two numbers together, you add two distributions together. Okay? And so if you think about it that way, and value a trade based on the total number of future games expected by players as a result of those picks, you often find that if you can get more picks, there's no reason why you couldn't trade draft pick 1 for picks 8 and 12 or something like that. Even though draft pick 1 is kind of going to get you more games on average per player, there's still a lot of uncertainty. You often do quite well by trying and get more players through that swapping of picks. Okay, so Jeff and I have written a little bit of code that gives you a sense of how do you compare multiple picks in terms of trading. So here we've got picks. So the different lines represents the expected number of games. So over the left-hand side means the player didn't perform very well. To the right is that player did really well. But you can see that, so the black line here is for pick 10. So if you combine the picks, was it 10 and 47 with 14 and, can't even read it on my screen. So 14 and 35 is going to give you about the same expected future number of games as 10 and 47 are. Okay, whereas 19, if you swap that for picks 24 and 59, it's not clear. I reckon most AFL teams would probably go for 19 rather than 24 and 59, but there is a lot of uncertainty there, which you can mitigate somewhat by having more players involved in that transfer. And so, in fact, 24 and 59 is likely to give you a fair few more games out of players in total than just 19 by itself. Okay, so it's just another tool to help you think about, in this case, the value of uncertainty. So Jeff and I have worked a lot on this. If people are interested, again, we would both be very happy to talk to you about it. Otherwise, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you enjoyed it.
So we've got time for questions. I might take questions from the room first, then go online. And I did mute everyone online, so stick your hand up if you're having trouble coming off mute. Any questions in the room? Yes, Craig. I'll repeat the question because the audio doesn't go through often.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Shane. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm Craig. I'm representing the Mighty Fighting Hawks.
All right. Sorry about last weekend.
I'm just interested, Shane, in that overall trend of players peaking at the earlier age.
Yeah.
Is some of that perhaps driven by the other end, the older players retiring earlier over that trend through concussion, the greater awareness of concussion? Or
That's a good question.
Creating space for those younger players to move into the system earlier.
So the question is are older players retiring earlier potentially driving that trend of younger players peaking earlier?
It's a good question. I haven't looked at that. In fact, the 40-year-old, if I remember correctly, was Dustin Fletcher. But then you've still got Pendlebury and a bunch of players that are still playing to quite an old age. But it'd be interesting to just have a look and see at what age are players dropping out of the system now. I don't know whether it's a change in mindset of team selectors, managers, whether they're putting extra value on younger players versus older players. But you could look at that. You could see what age are they dropping out of the system, and rank and relate it to where they appear to be in the sort of the pecking order, I guess, in terms of that deviation. But at the same time, you can see that because the mean for a particular age is way above sort of an average player, clearly that's only going to happen if you're weeding out a lot of the younger players, fairly early on. So that's the only way you're going to get that mean rising. So I suspect there's not a lot of change, but I'd have to look at it. I think maybe it's the other way, is that they're weeding out younger players earlier now than what they were before. So new younger ones come in. I'm not sure.
Yes.
Do your data have the capacity to allow you to look at interactions between players at this point? You said that the teams, there's a lot of noise, maybe there's, the game. Can you look at that as an example?
So the question is there enough data to look at interactions between players?
It's sounding now like a population ecology model. But there'd be an argument for trying to do that potentially. So you know that there are some positions, I guess maybe something like your full forward who you try not to have too many full forwards, or if you have two players that typically play a position, but then one has to suddenly play a subordinate role because the other player is given preference. You could ask the question, how much has a player's performance changed depending on who else in their team is also selected? You'd have to have some pretty intimate knowledge of players and how they interact to know who to look for that. But you could, I guess, if you're a list manager and you want to ask, do we keep 3 key forwards? What happens to player performance when we try and throw them in the team at the same time compared to when they're not all in the team at the same time? So there's certainly, I don't see any reason why you couldn't look for that with this model.
Yes. Scott.
Thank you.
I'm just interested in the aspect of the weather.
Yeah.
Obviously, major component in football is what you can't control. Weather's one of those things.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
So the question is, what's the impact of the weather?
I bet weather does. Maybe I could scrape bomb and get some game day data there, and then take into account whether you're playing at Marvel Stadium or not. Temperature, I don't know. I bet it plays a role. I suspect it won't change the general conclusions, but if you're more interested in what's going to happen on a particular day, then maybe more details about that particular day would be worthwhile incorporating into your prediction.
Yes.
Hi Shane, I'm Nick. Thanks very much. That was really enjoyable and asked some questions. My little one was just a simple one around your anecdotal opinion on Jake Stringer.
All right. I don't know. In fact, I didn't quite realise it until I poked my head up and his head's it's not really fine.
So the question is Shane's opinion on Jake Stringer.
In the dark.
Should the Crows go for him? I don't know. It's sort of like hands off from my point of view. It's the data is saying. It'd be interesting to know, what the games where he was perceived to have played well. He's an interesting character because he kind of some players, or sometimes he's sort of derided, I guess, for his performance for being a bit lethargic, and he's a game changer in other times. So it'd be interesting to know how well that normal perception of how he performed relates to that metric that I'm using. I don't know how that works. The other thing, I guess, is I guess the variation in player performance between games. I sort of assume that the variation that a player typically has between their games is sort of on a par with each other. But in theory, you could try and work out who are these players that are more over the shop than others, and maybe that's playing some of the role. But yeah, there's certainly be a couple of things you could look at there.
I've got to take an online question from Wei Tan. Have you done any analysis using number of seasons since first season in place of age? So time since starting rather than age.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I was hoping that sort of age roughly correlates with experience, but there's no reason, in fact, why I couldn't have, maybe it's worthwhile looking, would be the number of games played. So that's certainly in the database. You can get, is it age plus, and it's more of a direct measurement, I guess, of experience to ask what's going on there. That'd certainly be worthwhile looking at. It's a good question.
Any more questions online? You can put your questions into the Slack or into the meeting chat and I'll read them out. The Melbourne Hub's flashing. No, that's Hobart.
Hi, Melbourne. We've got a question here. Can you hear us?
Yep, we can.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Good, thank you. It's Alan Pope. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I know precious little about sport concern, but I certainly found it very interesting.
Thank you.
So I'm getting an echo, which is a little bit confusing, but I'll keep going. The question I have is, in the United States, professional sport uses a great deal of data analytics, I believe. You've obviously done this work as a fan rather than as a professional sports analyst. Is there an industry of sports analytics here that is used by the AFL, for example?
So I've had a little bit of experience. So Dean Dagan works for the Adelaide Crows, and they certainly, I don't know exactly. I wish I could give you the exact answer here, but I think most AFL teams, or maybe all of them, do have some sort of data, some dedicated data analyst associated with the team that I assume does a much better job than what I just did there because they spend full time on it. So, but it'd be interesting to, at least Jeff and I have made contact with the Crows and had some success there, which has been fantastic. But I'm not quite sure what other teams are doing or what their approaches are. There's so many ways you can model the same set of data. An interesting thing would just be to give the same set of data, the same questions to different statisticians and just let them run loose and see sort of how they approach the same question in potentially different ways.
Got an assignment to write?
I do. I've got students. I'm not sure I'll get them to do AFL. I did in my first stats lecture a few weeks ago with some of my students. I got them to predict the probability that they would kick behind based on how far out from goal they were and what the angle was. So you can bring this into teaching. I'll certainly try and do that.
Any more questions for Shane? Russell.
Sorry. Well, you mentioned that there was this interesting phenomenon where the predictions for older players was a little bit off because the players, the ones that lost the ball were better. Could you incorporate something about that in the model, and then possibly have some measure of longevity? That might be another way of measuring performance.
So the question is the older players are above the average. Can that be incorporated into the model using some measure of longevity, perhaps?
Just a quick thought about it. You kind of turn into a survival analysis, I guess, where based on their deviation, you can ask the question based on your age and where you're perceived to be, sort of, I guess, in your cohort. Typically, what's the chance you then fall out of the system? And if you could model that well, then you could ask, well, what's the average performance for an age expected to be, given that you've modeled the selection process as well? And you get a sense of at what point does a team sort of give up maybe on a player and say, look, time to move on. It'd be interesting to see how well it correlates being removed from a list based on where the model's ranking players. That would be interesting. But yeah, survival analysis, you could bring that in. Yes.
Shane or Richard, thanks for that chat. Just, it was interesting to see the ruck discrepancy, like 22, like as a general rule, ruckman over time peaked later in their career.
Yep.
That was quite significant. To be so young, 22, that like, particularly the way the game is gone and running now, probably being a better ruckman.
So there's an observation about the ruck peak age declining so much.
Well, yeah, I tried to make a mention that that's the one I'm a bit hairy on. So if you look at the data, exactly as you're saying, so in 2024, the average age of players was typically, well to the right, and it's trying to fit a curve through that data. And even though in fact it's suggesting that you would peak at a younger age in 2024, there's in fact very few players at that age. So I'm not quite sure how much I believe this one. This one's the hardest one because there's the fewest players in that position. So trying to get a good idea of what's going on with ruckman. But if you look at the data, so in 2012, there are a lot of young ruckmen out there. Whereas in 2024, it had typically shifted, like you said, to the older players, which would suggest that they're getting better at a younger age. But again, that green line is for an average ruckman. So maybe they get weeded out very quickly now. And what you're left with are the really good ruckmen who are older. So, you're picking off the cream, and so that's why it's a little bit hard to read and interpret this. These predictions are for a typical player, whereas we see what's happening for selected players. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy there.
Jeff?
Thanks, Shane. Just on the ruck, so I noticed if you go forward, I think a couple of slides, there's when you had your clubs versus, that Sydney, presumably that's Grundy right up the top there.
Yeah.
And that kind of gets me thinking, well, firstly you might say, sorry, Paul, you're going to have to repeat this. I'm going to rattle on for a bit. That starts making you think, how important are rucks? And because you're right, like the rest of the Sydney Swans, they're a bit above average, but that's quite a strong positional strength that Sydney have. And then that starts then leading to the question that I think you and I have talked about a bit, which is what is the mix of ability and position that you want in a premiership team? And I do wonder whether that's something that we can move from this work into looking back across the last X years. What is the cohort of and mix of players that they had that then led to success? And how should you then, is anyone from the Tasmanian Footy Club here? How should you deal with that team to get that success given age and ability?
So, Jeff, just gave a discussion about how you mix the attributes of the multiple categories together to make a team.
All right. Well, so
The answer tomorrow.
yeah, tomorrow have a paper written. The ruck's an interesting one because you've got Gawn. Gawn's actually the best ranked ruckman in 2024, and Melbourne were way out of the 8. So it's clearly not just having a great ruckman. But obviously, you know, and so I did this not expecting much and kind of didn't get much here, except but maybe there's a little bit of a trend, but it's, if anything I take out of this is that you need a full complement, really. You know, you can't just have a stacked forward line. You know, can we? Well, maybe you can. Or that's a non-key forward. So if we look at key forwards, well, I guess Sydney are doing all right there. You know, in fact, Sydney are pretty consistent across a bunch of sort of, you've got their key defenders are pretty good, their key forwards are pretty good. But again, yeah, exactly. It's not an easy thing to predict. This is also, there's a bit of a caveat here because this is the data at the end of the year. These points I only fitted it to about mid-season. So in fact, I should redo this with all of the 2024 data. Didn't have time to do that. And maybe that'll tighten up a bit more of a relationship there. But it may not be too different because this is sort of a metric of how that player sort of typically performed throughout their career. So unless the teams have changed dramatically from the first half to the second half, it may still be like that. But it does suggest it's a team game. You know, you're going to do better if you've got a bunch of high-ranked players in key positions, but it's certainly not enough to guarantee high performance.
Well, I think we've gone a bit over time, but thank you everyone for coming. And can we please thank Shane again? And those of us in Hobart, some of us are heading out to Jack Green now for beers and burgers. And stay tuned for the next Statistical Society event, Melbourne only in October, and the next Hobart Hub in November. Thanks very much.